It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Maybe you've already been hearing about the new book by New York Times White House reporters Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan called Regime Change Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump. Maybe you know about it because it's not just an analysis of Trump's second term. The book and a few Times articles on the way to the book have made real news about what's been going on inside the Situation Room, like about how the Epstein files paralyzed the White House. They use the word paralyzed, and on their decision to attack Iran against the advice of almost everyone except Benjamin Netanyahu. But the book also has Trump telling Netanyahu regarding Gaza that, quote, all the Jews are sick of you. You don't need any more prelude than that. Again, the title of the book is Regime Change Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump by New York Times White House reporters Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan. Maggie and Jonathan, thanks for sharing your reporting with us. Welcome back to WNYC.
Brian, thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
So before we get into Epstein and Iran and Netanyahu and more, why in your subtitle, the Imperial Presidency? Maggie, why that word?
Well, a couple of things, Brian. As we were reporting out this book, it became very clear to us, and this book was the product of several years of reporting, although we focus on the first 14 months of President Trump's second term. One of the key facets of this presidency so far is a massive expansion of executive power, either powers that have sort of been gray areas or powers that Trump is simply claiming that had either been held by Congress or had been, checked by either inspectors general or judges have weighed in on. And it's simply, a reflection of how Donald Trump wants to govern, and frankly, how many of his advisors believe that the only branch of government with any real standing is the executive branch. So I don't think that was especially surprising. In terms of the regime change piece, it also became clear to us that this was not a normal transfer, not just a transfer of power, but from one political party to another. Donald Trump is fundamentally changing the way this country and frankly the world looks at the American presidency, possibly forever, but certainly right now.
And Jonathan, still on the word imperial, would you say Trump had a vision of a new American imperialism that he came into this second term with? Venezuela, Cuba, Greenland, Iran?
There's no question. When we sat down with President Trump at the end of the process of reporting this book, March the 16th, we're in the Oval Office. It's the 17th day of the war with Iran. Donald Trump handed us a 2-page document that he said was written by a historian, and he wanted us to read it, and sat there watching us while we read it, and he started to read it. And the document said, the first sentence was something to the effect of, Donald Trump is the most powerful man who's ever existed, who's ever lived on the planet. And then it went on to compare him not to former American presidents, not to small d democratic leaders, but rather to figures like Napoleon, Mao, Stalin, Hitler, Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, the Caesars, William the Conqueror, shape the world and put his stamp on America, both in a literal way by building monuments to himself, but also by taking huge risks and big, bold moves like pushing for regime change in Venezuela, authorizing that operation to snatch Maduro, taking America into war again in the Middle East, in Iran, without even talking to Congress. I mean, remember when this country went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, as flawed as the decision-making was, there was a process, and they went to Congress, which of course has under the Constitution is the branch of government that has the authority to declare war. There was approval from Congress. Trump didn't even talk to Congress. So when we talk about imperial presidency, it's not just exercise of unilateral power, but it's also reshaping the world putting his imprint on the world in a way that, in Trump's mind, I think he wasn't comparing himself in a moral sense to those other leaders, but more that they were the great figures, capital G, great figures of their time, and we're still talking about them. And I think that's where he wants to put himself for history.
Power, power, power. Just one other thing on Venezuela, Jonathan. You have Trump telling some of his people that Venezuela could be the 51st state and he would appoint a governor to run it. He wasn't serious about that, was he? About a territory that far away and with a Latino Spanish speaking population, very much like people he's trying very hard to deport as many of us as he can?
Oh, I think he's dead serious. And in fact, even if it hasn't literally happened, I think in their minds, they believe that they essentially control Delcy Rodriguez, who is running Venezuela. And she is a much more pliant figure than Maduro. Trump sees Venezuela essentially as a giant oil field. So it's a very, very sort of 19th century colonial view of America's neighborhood. When Trump looks at the map and sees these large areas of territory like Greenland and Canada and Venezuela, he sees American dominion. Should be American land, American controlled. He doesn't respect borders and sovereignty in the way that American presidents have before him.
Maggie, on the decision to start the Iran war, although I'm still processing Jonathan's last sentence there about Trump, of all people, not respecting borders when he ran on nothing but borders, but on the decision to start the Iran war, you reported that Trump's advisors were surprised by how much Trump's hawkishness and I guess optimism about an Iran invasion aligned with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's. Can you say aligned in what ways?
I can, and I will answer that in 1 second, Brian. But I want to go to just for a second, your surprise about what Jonathan was just saying in terms of the borders issue and what Trump ran on versus how he is approaching what he thinks that his presidency in the United States should be entitled to. One of the things that is starkly clear in this presidency, and but has been clear about Trump for a very, very long time, particularly for people who knew him in New York and covered him in New York over many years, and you and I are among them, is that what he says about what other people should be able to do is not always consistent with what he is going to do. And so I think it's entirely in keeping with one of his approaches. But in terms of Netanyahu and Iran, look, Netanyahu, with whom Trump had a very difficult relationship over the few years out of power, he was very angry at Netanyahu for the sin of acknowledging that Joe Biden had won the election in 2020. And that took some repair work. But the reality is that of all issues, Trump has always been more hawkish than on other countries about Iran, and certainly more so than his teams in both terms, but really his team in this one. So many people around the president in his 2024 campaign truly believed in the idea of no new foreign wars, no new incursions in the Middle East. But Trump obviously said that too. But in terms of Iran, he was always more open to, and our reporting showed, aligned with a longer term idea of what Netanyahu wanted, which was, the grand change in Iran, being the person who brought a difference to Iran after 47 years of conflict and anger toward the U.S. And Trump, by the time this all happened, when he finally, brought the U.S. into war in a full way with Israel on February 28th, he had taken out Maduro, the head of a sovereign nation, using the U.S. military, and just snatched him and brought him to the U.S. And he truly believed that this could be done quickly, and he believed that things would work out because, as he said to one ally, they always do. And it's a version of that. I'm paraphrasing, but he believed this would be quick. And get a fast result. And that obviously is not what happened. But, things are not black and white. Obviously, Netanyahu did campaign to get the president alongside him, including in a remarkable Situation Room meeting that we write about in the book. It was pretty extraordinary having a foreign leader there explaining these war plans. And one other point that our reporting showed, Brian, is this effort was so secretive, even inside the Trump government, that the Treasury Secretary and the Energy Secretary weren't part of these initial meetings to talk about a possible war. The people who would have to manage a global energy crisis because the administration was so worried about leaks. But
And
yes,
the
Trump was
economic
sold.
and the economic impact.
Correct. But they were not in the meetings because the Trump administration was so concerned about word spreading outside of these meetings. So yes,
Hmm.
Netanyahu did sell Trump, but Trump was not simply being strung along here. This is something he wanted to do.
You reported that Netanyahu convinced Trump in that Situation Room meeting that they could destroy Iran's missile program so quickly and completely that Iran couldn't close the Strait of Hormuz. So Trump actually had in mind, I'm going to do this without them being able to close the Strait of Hormuz. Maggie, like that was a particular risk and he thought he could avoid it?
He did. He thought he could avoid it, but I want to also note here, Brian, that his own government, Trump's own government, top advisors warned him that the regime change scenarios that Benjamin Netanyahu had presented, he showed them in a video in this Situation Room with possible leaders who could take over in a regime change scenario, that those fantasies, excuse me, I shouldn't say fantasies, those scenarios which the CIA and the intelligence community had looked at the day after, in the hours after the Netanyahu meeting, the CIA director told the president, again in another Situation Room meeting, that they were farcical. Marco Rubio used an expletive to be more precise about it. They did think aspects of what Netanyahu had talked about could be accomplished, such as taking out Iran's ballistic missiles program. There was no one in Trump's government who thought this was a good idea. Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned about munitions depletion, warned the closure of the Strait of Hormuz was a possibility. The president wanted to go ahead and do this. But the only person who really aggressively told the president that this was unwise and was against it was Vice President Vance, and it cost Vance with the president.
Cost him? How?
It irritated Trump. He was not happy about it. And Vance made his views known in the final meeting, the go, no go meeting before the president gave the order. Vance again said, you know how I feel about this, but, this is your decision. It is a team that believes it is there not to stop Donald Trump, not to change a dangerous worldview, as John Kelly or Jim Mattis viewed it in term one, but to help him achieve what he wants to achieve as best as possible. So it's not a surprise that they told him this was his choice, but it is not the case that Trump was unaware of the risks.
Listeners, if you're just joining us, my guests are New York Times White House reporters Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan with their new book, Regime Change Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump. Jonathan, to this moment, you report on when Trump said to Netanyahu about Gaza, quote, everybody's sick of you, Bibi. All the Jews are sick of you. Even the two Jews on this call are sick of you, unquote. Of course, those two Jews are Trump's Mideast envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. What was the context for that remark, and when was that relative to the Iran war meeting?
Yeah, that was a phone call in October last year. I'm right, Maggie, October? Correct me if I'm wrong.
It was
during the
September.
final.
It was September, end of September,
Was it
27th. Yeah.
Late September. It was before final hostages out of Gaza, and Trump was worried or had been told that Netanyahu was in the hostage deal. And he gets Netanyahu on the phone and absolutely unloads on him and says exactly what you just quoted. Trump has had a very up and down relationship with Netanyahu for many years, as Maggie laid out. And there's no love lost for Netanyahu from Jared Kushner or Steve Witkoff either. They were both on the phone. And someone familiar with that phone call later described it to us, quote unquote, as epic. So that's been a very, very complicated relationship. But all that having been said, when we sat down with Trump in March to discuss all of this, he said that Netanyahu is a good partner to have in wartime. He said he's a good wartime partner, and he said he's not afraid of war. So I think Trump, until, recently when he's decided that Netanyahu was an obstacle to him getting out of this war, Trump saw Netanyahu as a solid wartime partner, but someone who was very difficult to deal with. And that phone call was a real sort of a very explosive moment in that
Well,
relationship.
that, which you've now revealed in the book, was a private moment between the two of them. More recently, Trump and Vance have been very critical of Israel publicly. In, let's say, the last week or two regarding Lebanon, they basically accused Israel of war crimes without using that term, but saying you don't have to knock down a whole building because one Hezbollah guy runs in there and things like that. Jonathan, do you have any indication this will come with consequences? Because it's still almost only Democrats in Congress who vote against military aid to Israel to allow them to continue what Trump describes in these ways.
Yeah, we don't have any reporting or indication that Republicans, it would be an earthquake if congressional Republicans moved to that position. We don't see any indication of that right now, but it's something that pro-Israel Republicans are worried about, this changing sentiment, particularly within young Republican voters. It's very obvious in the polls that young Republicans are souring on Israel. And when you have Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, the two leaders of the party, openly criticizing Netanyahu and their policies, that only will exacerbate those concerns.
Maggie, your book reports on Trump and the Epstein files. One thing that seemed to surprise you is that meetings about Epstein also took place in the Situation Room of the White House. What's the significance of that?
Well, what's notable about it, Brian, is that the White House Situation Room complex, it's a series of rooms. George Stephanopoulos did a very big piece about its redesign and renovation during the Biden years. He wrote a book about the history of the Situation Room under various presidents. It's been used to monitor wars. It has been used to monitor national disasters. It has been used to handle other you know, communications crises that related to, say, foreign policy, or disputes with a foreign leader. But these were meetings, again, held there to avoid leaks, to discuss how to handle what was becoming a politically disastrous situation for the Trump administration in terms of the anger within the MAGA base that files related to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell had not been made public, as several prominent top officials in the Trump administration had spent years calling for. The vice president, Kash Patel, the FBI director, Dan Bongino, then the deputy FBI director, they had made names in the MAGA media ecosystem on podcasts and interviews, saying that everything should be opened up. They wanted to release everything. Trump, to be clear, and we say this in the book, was always far more half-hearted about that himself in what he said. But these were meetings. There were a series of them held, Brian. We only focused in on these three, and everything is not black and white. To be clear, there were officials in Trump's world, top advisors, who were concerned about Epstein's victims. But these particular meetings that we wrote about were overwhelmingly about how to deal with Trump's complete disinterest in putting anything out and how to calm down a very angry base. And it was extraordinary because you had the most senior levels of the White House there, the vice president, the White House chief of staff, White House counsel, comms officials from the White House, the attorney general, the deputy attorney general, the FBI director, and that's just a partial list in many of these meetings, discussing how to get themselves out of what they saw as an intractable mess.
Would it be fair to say, though, that despite so many references to Trump in the files, there's no evidence he did anything wrong. So the idea that Trump has culpability regarding Epstein, like these many other people who've now, lost their jobs or been humiliated in other walks of life, for all the talk, there's just nothing actually damaging there about Trump.
Well, a couple of things. Some of to be clear, we have no reporting that suggests that Trump, did anything involved that was involved in Epstein's crimes. That is not what anything that close to anything we learned. Number one, and number two, we focused on these meetings because these were meetings about what his advisors were concerned about. They didn't even really know what was in these files necessarily. They certainly didn't know, the Maine Justice Department, the extent of how much was there until much later in the year, when the Southern District of New York started producing just reams and reams of material. What they did go through and knew existed included 302 forms, these intake notes from FBI interviews with witnesses, including some victims, and that there were references to Trump in them. It didn't mean that there were accusations necessarily about Trump, but his name came up in them. And then a New York Times analysis, many months later, once a number of files were released, showed that there were 38,000 references to Trump, his family, some of his properties, including Mar-a-Lago. For instance, Brian, one thing that was mentioned in these files that were made public ultimately was that Trump had flown on Epstein's plane many more times than was known, and there were pictures of that. It didn't have to be some kind of evidence of an alleged crime. It just had to be something with his name in it, and he did not want anything out there. He didn't even want to talk about it, Brian, which is very important.
So more to what his advisors knew or thought. Couple of texts from listeners coming in. One, so much has been made about his mental facilities. Did the writers get a sense of whether Trump has shown signs of mental decline or dementia? And another one related, the way this book was teased out on The View was that many people pretended not to know what they actually knew was very real and dangerous about Donald Trump, and that this book would reveal what these people knew and when they knew it and how that left Americans unprotected. Yet no interview that I've seen, writes this listener, has revealed any of this. I wonder if you might get to some of this in your interview. So, Jonathan, to either of those texts.
Well, Trump's health is an area that we really did our absolute best to try to shed more light on for readers and for Americans. We completely failed to break ground on that. It is one of the best sort of guarded areas of information in the White House. We know several things. We know that he has chronic venous insufficiency. The blood flow in his legs is problematic, and you see the heavy swelling around his ankles. Obviously, he's an 80-year-old man who is falling asleep a lot during the day, and they've not been transparent at all with his medical information that they're releasing. But beyond that, it's really just what people can observe for themselves. We don't have any new information about his cognitive condition or any other aspect of his health, but it remains something that we are reporting on and trying to dig out. I didn't fully understand the other question. My apologies, but
I think I'll just read part of it again. The way this book was teased out on The View was that many people pretended not to know what they actually knew was very real and dangerous about Donald Trump, and that this book would reveal what these people knew and when they knew it. So, Jonathan, any particular that fills in that void as the listener perceives it to be a void?
Honestly, far less of that than in the first term. I mean, in the first term, the experience that Maggie and I had, and many other reporters who covered the White House, was that people who worked for Trump at the most senior levels thought that he was dangerous, mocked him behind his back, and saw that acting the country or the world from his impulses. I mean, you had people like James Mattis, his first Secretary of Defense, Rex Tillerson, his first Secretary of State, Gary Cohn, his top economic advisor. All of them fundamentally disagreed with Trump on profound issues of principle and policy. This term, he's surrounded by people who believe in him, who like him, who want him to, who want to execute on his wishes. It's a completely different environment. And yes, there are disagreements, over the Iran war, for example. There were, it was very hard to find anyone at the senior level who thought before the war that it was a good idea. But just a profoundly different environment. You don't get people, even off the record, quietly, whatever, behind his back saying these things. It's just a totally different reporting environment. So I'm not sure that that's accurate
Okay.
description of the book.
Maggie, listener text says, journalism question from former CUNY professor. When your guests quote Trump or others secondhand, why is it legitimate to use quotation marks suggesting they were there or heard a recording? I guess that goes, for example, to the quote that I did say was in quotes from the book, Trump to Netanyahu, everybody's sick of you, Bibi, all the Jews are sick of you. So to that journalism practice question.
Sure. So we have an extensive sourcing note about our approach at the start of the book, and forgive me because I don't have it in front of me right now, or I would just read directly from it. But basically, when we use direct quotes, it's because somebody was involved in that conversation or heard something directly. If there is some dispute about what was said, but there is a general consensus, in other words, not that there's enough overlap where it's the general gist of it, even if the exact verbiage was not recalled precisely the same way by different people. We write it in as a background without quotations. But we have tried to be as transparent as possible, Brian, about our approach. But we also know that lots of people took risks to help us get this book accurate, and we have a duty as journalists to them to not go beyond that.
Yeah, I'll just add. I mean, the note,
Go ahead.
the note in the book is if it's in quotes, it's either by the person who spoke it and verified,
Yeah.
or someone who is a participant or a witness to the conversation,
Yeah.
or based on a recording.
Yeah.
We have just a few minutes left with New York Times White House reporters Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan on their new book, Regime Change Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump. I want to make sure to touch on one other topic in the book, which is the small fortune, no, actually a big fortune, that Trump has amassed during his second term as president. This aggressive profit seeking from the office is premised on something Trump said in January: nobody cares. Did he say that to one of you?
No, he said it to our colleagues in an interview with him in the Oval Office, four of our White House colleagues, and it was a really remarkable quote.
Expand on it.
Well, this was an interview that David Sanger, Katie Rogers, Zolan Kano-Young, and Tyler Pager had with the president. It was actually the same day, if I'm remembering correctly. And Jonathan, please correct me if I'm not, that Renee Good was killed in Minnesota. And part of this interview was them asking him why he was suggesting that she had run over a federal agent with her car when there was it was very hard to see what he was talking about, and that was in wide dispute, that had happened that way. But they were asking him about money making during this presidency and profiting, personal profiting during this presidency, and he said that he had prohibited. I'm paraphrasing here, but that he had prohibited his sons from doing deals at his company, which he did not put in a blind trust in term one, and he does not now either. But that he nobody I'm allowed to do it was part of it, and nobody cared. And by nobody cared, he was suggesting that he's just not going to get our interpretation of it. He's not going to have problems because of it, meaning that it didn't lead to who knows what else, impeachment, etc. It certainly led to emoluments clauses, lawsuits, and other attempts at trying to have some kind of accountability for it. But he was also angry that he didn't get credit. This is his thing about everything, is that he's not getting proper credit, that he should have gotten credit for making some kind of a sacrifice in his mind. And it was essentially, if I didn't get credit for stepping away from my company in some form or another, or giving up on some kind of income, what's the point? And Brian, the reality is that is how he sees a lot of the world, which is if people aren't going to acknowledge that I did something, what is the point?
Yeah.
And as you have seen, the money making for his family is expansive and unlike anything we have seen before.
Jonathan, 30 seconds. Any indication that revelations in the book will have any impact on politics or policy?
Oh, we don't, you know, if we wrote books with that in mind, we'd be very sort of miserable people. So we just, our job is to put the information out there. How people want to
Yeah,
use it or act upon
exactly.
it is up to them.
And the book just came out yesterday, so maybe that question is a little premature. Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan's new book is called Regime Change Inside the Imperial Trump Presidency. And they will be talking about the book in conversation with Andrew Sorkin at the 92nd Street Y. If you want to see them in person, that's tomorrow night, Thursday night, at 7 o'clock at the 92nd Street Y. Ticket info for in-person or streaming at 92y.org, 92y.org. Jonathan and Maggie, thank you so much for sharing this book with us.
Thanks so much
Thank you,
for having
Brian.
us.